family, friends and former colleagues of Sam Moyo, members of the SMAIAS board, Josh Nyoni, Temba Maluleka, Masehu Majuamuse, Pabinja Parisieros, Walter Chambati, Executive Director of SMAIAS, and members of staff of SMAIAS, all the participants of the Agrarian Summer School. A special welcome to those coming for the first time and those old participants who have been missing in action for a while. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. On behalf of the Agrarian South Network and SMAIAS, I wish to warmly welcome each and every one of you to the third annual Sam Moyo Memorial Lecture. This lecture, as you know, has been named to commemorate the life and work of our dear son, father, partner, brother, comrade, and friend, Professor Sam Moyo, former Executive Director of the African Institute for Agrarian Studies, now renamed in his honor as the Sam Moyo African Institute for Agrarian Studies. Sam was also the moving spirit behind the Agrarian South Network and this annual summer school. Sam served as the 12th president of Codesria between 2008 and 2011. Now it's my singular honor and my pride to chair this occasion and also to introduce to you the third memorial lecture. My sister, my friend from Ethiopia, Zen Tadesse. Zen, a feminist trailblazer and mentor to many of us, is an expert on social development and governance, with special emphasis on gender and alternative development. She served as the Executive Secretary of the Association of African Women for Research and Development, AWOD, and the head of publications and the Deputy Executive Secretary of Codesria, both located in Dakar, Senegal. She was also a founding member of the Forum for Social Studies and the managing editor of the Africa Review of Books. Zene has served on several boards, including those of the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, UNRISD, and the Development Alternatives with Women for a New Dawn, Dawn. Zene was, for 6 years, a member of the United Nations Committee for Development Policy. Between 2003 and 2005, Zene became the 10th president of the Council for the Development of Social Research in Africa, Codesria, the first woman to have been elected to this position, and the only person to have occupied senior positions at the Codesria Secretariat and to have become its president. Zene is currently the principal vice president of the Ethiopia Academy of Sciences. The title of her presentation today is Producing African-Based Knowledge, Our Legacies and Our Future. Zene will speak to us for between 45 and 50 minutes, followed by a question and answer session. And then we will launch a very important book. I won't tell you which book it is until you see it, but it's very special, I assure you. Let's welcome Zene to the podium to deliver her lecture. Thank you.
I'm not so great at protocol as my friend, so I will just greet the Sam Moyo family and all protocols observed. It's a great honor to be in this institute where I have wanted to come for a very long time but never managed to do so. And this is the first time I'm coming to Zimbabwe where Sam is absent. So it's both an honor and a very painful experience at the moment. I have known Sam since the mid-80s and have worked with him on very many issues and debated with him as well on other issues. And what I retained from him was not only his determination to see his dreams come true, but his love for this continent, for Zimbabwe particularly, Southern Africa as a whole, and the South as a whole. he was a real internationalist. He was both inspiring and fun to be with. When Walter invited me to this conference, to this occasion, I said to myself, I'm inspired by Sam, his big visions, his tremendous accomplishments. I want to do something as big, but I can assure you I didn't manage. So I have to warn you beforehand. And the choice of the topic was also in honor of Sam, because producing Africa-based knowledge was his greatest passion and challenge. For those of you who might not be fully conversant with African knowledge production, the reason why I insisted on Africa-based knowledge is because knowledge is also produced by others outside of Africa. And I will specifically stop at knowledge production in our continent. As you know, post-independence Africa has witnessed a tremendous enthusiasm, hope, and inspiration for the post-independent phase. And indeed, during the 2 decades that followed independence, our universities, which are the centers of knowledge in most of Africa until recently, were really vibrant places of debate, teaching, research, publishing, and distribution. As I am sure most of you have either gone through these universities, have read about them, and so forth, I will not belabor the point other than to say that our legacy, to begin with, to start with, was really one of hope, one of tremendous aspiration for our continent, and also an arena of contestation. The African University gave us the space to re-question what kind of university do we want, what kind of development our continent should follow, and what's the place of Africa in the world. So first and foremost, our legacy of the past is one of tremendous debate, aspiration, contestation, and a lot of expectations for our future. And I will not belabor the point because by the second decade of independence, we first had our challenge through conflicts with the state that really favored the creation of the university for a variety of bureaucratic and other nationalistic purposes, was not very happy that the university was also a space of critique and contestation of flag independence, what we then understood it to be as flag independence and not real independence that we have hoped for. And so this contestation with the state created a variety of changes within the university environment and the knowledge production. One was in some places, particularly in places where the military has already taken power in a number of African countries. It ranged from imprisonment to killings to all sorts of repressive measures by the state. Secondly, it also led to the reduction of resources to universities, which began to create difficulties in terms of producing knowledge, distributing knowledge, and even teaching itself. But this period, of course, compared to what followed in the next decade, which was the 1980s, the era of structural adjustment, was still relatively productive, in quotes, in terms of knowledge. But it also created a sense of some of us self-censoring ourselves because the environment did not allow the type of free debates and free engagements of the first era. And secondly, we just did not, some of us did not have the courage to confront the power of the state, which was becoming quite ominous. So it was in the late 1970s that these minor issues that I'm covering took place, but it did begin to affect the overall production of knowledge, because, as I said, we began to self-censor or to just withdraw from any kind of critical research, or some decided to be part of the state structure, and so forth. Then came the late 1980s, or the beginning of the 1980s, when most of Africa's economies faced severe crisis due to global dislocations, but also international financial institutions deciding that Africa needed to be under their direct domain. So structural adjustment in terms of production of knowledge has been disastrous, and this has been extensively documented. In the first instance, the World Bank and its cohorts decided that Africa did not need universities. It was sufficient to have good elementary and secondary education at best. And if there are people who have to go to universities, they can go abroad. So the first thing was massive cuts to allocation of resources to the university. And that meant no teaching materials, no teaching infrastructure, and teachers, instructors getting very, very low wages, as well as students having to pay fees. So this dislocation, which has been extensively documented, is something I'm not going to spend a lot of time about, but I think the long-term impact of structural adjustment to the production of knowledge is something worth dwelling upon. Because although we talk about the lost decade, sometimes the 2 decades, my own sense of structural adjustment or the hegemony of neoliberalism is that it's still with us in many ways, and especially in our educational institutions, and specifically in our universities, where most knowledge in our continent is produced. And the first thing that happened, in addition to disillusionment of many faculty members, senior faculty members, packing and leaving the continent, those who remained had to engage in a number of income-generating activities, which are very far from the production of knowledge. And therefore, those especially who engaged in consultancy, or what Tandika called the Consultancy Syndrome, survived financially, but they stopped really being the university professors that they were before. So in addition to being absent from the university environment, which means no tutorials, no advice to students, etc., they actually began to use their consultancy reports as text material. And also started teaching students research methods that are not what we call university methodology, theory, or empirical work. Research in general really deteriorated in a number of ways. One is the people who do being forced to get engaged in other things. But secondly, the lack of books, the lack of research money, traveling money to the field, all this changed the research environment in dramatic ways. the university became diversified. As you know, one of the good things about post-independent African universities, the democratic nature of post-independent African universities. And please excuse my audacity to generalize about Africa, because there are some universities that didn't go through all this, and some less than others. Fee-paying universities, some of them established by religious orders, became important components of the higher education system. And that has led to regulatory changes with regard to quality and generating debates about access, equity, diversity, and secular foundation of the higher education system. And this, as I'm sure you can assume, I'm implying that it had dramatic changes in terms of the quality of university teaching and research, particularly the erosion of secular foundations. And the changing conditions in the economic, technology, and sociology of knowledge, both in its production and dissemination, also have tremendous impacts on African universities. These have meant new networks and strategic alliances between universities at the national, regional, and global level. On another level, it also has intensified the inequalities between our region and the rest of the world. But it also brought with it, through WTO and World Trade Organization General Agreement on Trade and Services, they started educational services, trading in educational services in the South. And this has also only aggravated the deterioration of research as we knew it, because these are quick consultants who come through these educational services and give very short-term seminars and short-term skill-based encounters, and so students do not get the benefit of the full range of educational skills that they would have if our universities functioned as before. And another thing that coincided by 1980 is the massification of universities. The enrollment increased tremendously while the resources were insufficient even for those students who were already engaged in the university. So this had tremendous implications and continue to have tremendous implications for both university academic programs and governance of the university. And the impact, as I said, of the prolonged crisis has been really the most impact, its most direct impact beyond its human consequences on those who worked in the universities, has been this more tangible and intangible changes within the university environment. And I'll get to that, I'll come back to that in a little while. However, not all African scholars opted outside of academic endeavors. Some opted to create networks of intellectual networks where they can bring whatever meager resources together to continue their debate, their work, and so forth. That's how Sam and I met in these kinds of networks. And this was really a lifesaver for people like Sam, who were committed to research, to teaching the young generation, and doing field work. Because, for example, being members of CODESRIA meant that there was some resource to maintain work in agrarian transformations in Southern Africa or in Africa. And that's one of the roles he played. Georgie mentioned the fact that he was the vice president and president of CODESRIA. But beyond that, I think I am convinced, in fact, that had it not been for people like Sam and Georgie and a few others, Issa, who are committed to agrarian change and to rural development, that would have been a dismal field, because since it mostly requires field work to go to the rural areas and do research, and it's not always in fashion in our continent in terms of attracting funding and so forth, a lot of people, including myself, have given up work in rural development. And so these determined souls have kept it going. And as far as Sam is concerned, he even gave it an institutional anchoring of its own. So what I really want to emphasize, however, is that there are all these initiatives, and especially since the new century, we see signs of revival of universities. At least some universities have survived and thrived, while others are still struggling with the problem, as I said, of massification, lack of resources, and so forth. And African universities still continue to not allocate sufficient amount of resources to universities. And so there are a number of donors who have come back in terms of financing, providing finance to higher education. Even those who said that Africa did not need a university have changed their mind and now say that because it is a knowledge economy, universities are important. But while it is welcome in terms of surviving the university, it has also meant donor influences in terms of selection of topics, in terms of privileging some departments over others, and limiting agenda setting, which the university enjoyed in a very widely prior to this period. And so, although this resource that has come from donors is keeping the site of knowledge production going, and some have been much more creative in terms of continuing their work in many other ways, it has also distorted knowledge production in other ways. And so, although there is a sense that the university and research is reviving in Africa, some of us are not completely convinced that it has gone back to its previous level of production, commitment, and contestation. So, if you look at the literature on African universities and the production of knowledge, there is a whole focus on rethinking knowledge production, numerous reflections on revitalizing higher education, and so forth. So this is a welcome focus. And in this process of rethinking, some very promising institutional anchoring debates and possibilities have emerged. So there were always these determined people to maintain knowledge production, teaching of younger generations, regardless of the difficulties and the difficulties of fundraising and sustaining such initiatives. So one, as I earlier indicated, is this Sam Moyo Institution of Agrarian Change, which is unique in a sense because it's focused mostly on agrarian change and labor relations. It has developed a South-South, a very vibrant South-South relationship, and it has also managed to maintain publication and dissemination of the knowledge product that comes out. In many such, even universities and other such institutions, the knowledge chain is fragmented because of lack of data, lack of resources. So some people produce, but they have to publish it elsewhere. Some people do not publish at all. So the knowledge production has not caught up with this revival that some people have been addressing, have been concerned about. And so some of the positive outcomes of this regeneration of university production of knowledge has been the setting up of institutions like, if you take Tanzania, through the initiative of Issa Shivji, there has been the Nyerere Research Center, Resource Center, which provided for about 6 years an annual celebration of intellectual festival, and it managed to bring together a number of researchers from different countries, from West Africa, North Africa, East and Southern Africa, where the issues of what does Pan-Africanism mean in this phase of our independence, and what did it mean during the era of Nyerere. Because, as I said earlier, in the early phase of our existence, there was a dismissal of leadership. We did not think that they were the type of leaders we ought to have in this continent, and so forth. And we tended to generalize all of them in the same box, that the state is very oppressive at the moment, as much as we need it for strategic development purposes. We need not adore the founding fathers, and most of them happen to be fathers. But this creation of the Tanzania Research Center created a moment where we can reflect back and examine our own expectations vis-a-vis the period where the Nyereres, the Nkrumahs, and the others survived. What else could they have done in the historical conjuncture in which they found themselves? And it was a very worthwhile reflection, because we were not doing that in the first phase that I mentioned. And and the documentation is also very important. What I found very impressive about this Tanzanian initiative, as you know, is Tanzania was one of these places that we all looked up to in the first phase of Africa's independence, because of vibrant debates and the type of intellectuals that went to Tanzania specifically because of its culture of debate and so forth. Like Walter Rodney, for example, and others. So that culture was maintained in a way by recreating other institutions that could make it possible to think back, for example, as to what did the Tanzania School mean? Did it really achieve anything? What else could have been handled, and so forth. So a retrospective and a future hope is provided. And Issa Shivji has been responsible for 2 different types of institutions of that nature. And that was building really on the past in a way. The other example is Mahmoud Mamdani's initiative in the University of Makerere, where he reorganized, he and his colleagues reorganized a research institution that has been there before and changed it into a graduate school. And it's not only the fact of changing it into a graduate school, but that as well gave a possibility of rethinking what a university teaching should look like, and what's the most important element that would facilitate production of knowledge going forward, and how can we overcome the deficiencies of our colonial education. This kind of reflections, again, have been based both on nurturing knowledge that exists within the sub-region of Africa, as well as international thinkers and so forth, to see how an educational system can be worked out that can produce real capable graduate students who can be equipped with knowledge production capacities and as well change the trajectory of higher education. And in the reflection of the setting up of this institution, in the process of setting up these institutions, Mamdani was able to identify a series of problems that structural adjustment and neoliberalism created for institutions like Makerere University and the department he was trying to create. And first was that it exasperated underfunding, underfinancing of Africa's public universities. Because the expectation that came with fee-paying students was that the students can pay, the students and their families could carry the cost of higher education with fee payments. The second problem that flowed from the first, according to him, is that the neoliberal solution to the financial crisis of Africa's public universities was to expand student enrollment. The third problem was the spread of the consultancy culture, which he calls consultancy culture, as that I referred to before, because it's something that has affected all our teaching institutions. So he gives concrete examples of how this consultancy syndrome, or consultancy culture, as he calls it, has been institutionalized within university environments. And he found out that short courses in research methods that teach students to gather and process quantitative information from which they can call answers. So he also found out that students in universities have stopped reading. The reading culture was being lost, and research for them meant answering questions that were prepackaged elsewhere. So a key component of the transformation they wanted to bring in this institution was to start from scratch and have students, first and foremost, formulate their own research questions, which is critical to research learning and production of genuine African knowledge, and also read a whole series of materials if they were to survive in that course, and reintroduced the program of seminars and study circles. When this is enumerated, those of you especially who come from other regions and who might take it for granted, I just want to emphasize that in very many universities, African universities, even today, this culture of debate, seminars, reading, and formulating one's own research agenda, and carrying out a really academic research project is lost due to some of the factors that I mentioned earlier. So reintroducing this is time-intensive, but absolutely necessary. But one of the reflections that I found interesting in Mamdani's reflection of what he discovered in the sense of setting up this graduate work was that he says that I have taught very long in the University of Tanzania, even in its good time. I have taught in Makerere, but at no time have we ever discussed the need for graduate students, for producing graduate students. So his main critique And that's been one of the good things about this revival talk within Africa about what's happening to knowledge production and to researchers, is the self-criticism. What did we do wrong? It is very easy and very apparent to see what neoliberal has done and the destruction of educational institutions. But our own role in terms of not having seen and proceeded through the reproduction of a new generation of Africans capable of doing their own research is something that we also have to be accountable for. So this notion that he says that if a true university that is going to reproduce itself is through having a very rigorous graduate program where you teach these skills that I have mentioned, and I do not want to repeat. So the other thing, through this method of looking into every aspect of the research process, they in this university in graduate work in Makerere are also questioning and trying to move away from the expansion and entrenchment of intellectual paradigms that stress quantification above all else. He thinks that this is one of the causes of intellectual dispensation in Africa today. So, creating from scratch, because they don't learn these things in undergraduate areas, is one of the challenges that they have been trying to address. And Lynn, who is a member of that faculty, might be able to enlighten us if you all have questions, because mine is borrowed from what I read about it, but she works there. So, since 2012, this has been the effort to introduce a solid reading culture and interdisciplinarity into their work, and postgraduate work becoming integral to university, not as a standalone faculty, he says, but one that requires endless injection of external funding and input. But all PhD students should be required to provide tutorials and thereby also improve their own teaching and learning skills. So the graduate students in this particular graduate school teach courses and research writing in other faculties. So he says, to quote him directly, the starting point of any critique of neoliberalism in higher education is the recognition that a university is not a business, but a place of scholarly pursuit. Its objective is to maximize scholarship, not profits. This again refers to the fact that privatization, commodification that has been introduced through neoliberalism has changed the ethos within the university, and universities are forced to raise money in any way they can, and that pressure has removed them from the ethos of higher education, research and teaching. There is a consensus that public funding should remain the most important source of finance, but initiatives that transform higher education from a public good to a private benefit has to be fiercely resisted. I think we have become so used to the withdrawal of African states, public expenditure to higher education, that most university administrators spend a considerable amount of their time chasing money to run their programs. And this has made it, it does not appear, at least on the face of it, that education is a public good. So this is one area of contestation that most people who care about universities and production of knowledge insist. And at the same time, in the words of Issa Shivji, we need to reform the gains of nationalism and go beyond it. It is a struggle. In this struggle, we should not lose the centrality of the struggle for ideas and the university as the center of ideas of struggle. Now, having touched upon some of the efforts to revive the university and to analyze what has gone wrong, I don't want to underestimate or give the picture that the university has recovered from the daunting challenges that it faces. Because well beyond the commodification and the culture that it brings with it, there are other challenges facing African universities and knowledge production at the moment. The response to misogyny has been limited to increasing the number of female students, administrators, as important as such reforms are. There is limited engagement in transforming the core curriculum towards a gender equal direction and transforming universities to gender-friendly spaces. And this is still a work in progress. I don't know how many of you had a chance to see a recent BBC documentary on grades for sale. Instructors demanding sexual favors in return for grades. So these kind of behaviors that resulted from the university departing from its old methods of teaching and comfortable pay and space to do work has created a lot of aberrations, and this is just one of them. The other challenge, especially as far as social science and humanity graduates are concerned, is that the push towards science, technology, engineering, and mathematics has been more important for Africans going forward, has meant a reduction in some universities, a closure of humanities and social science departments. And so this, which is justified through STEM being the only option to boost economic growth and preparing graduates for work in the digital economy, has also means the erosion of our ability to think, especially to think critically. And the fact that a true healthy university would have both social science and STEM faculties working together is being lost in some universities. In my own country, the government allocates 70% of its university budget to STEM. You can imagine, having given you the previous pictures, and also the crazy measure by my government has meant a real erosion in terms of knowledge production, debates, and capacities within universities. And I don't think it is an exceptional case. A lot of universities are going towards this whole business of dismissal of social sciences and humanities and liberal arts as irrelevant to the digital future and the digital economy. And that is really a misplaced understanding how these two fields reinforce each other. And this is, again, not a debate limited to Africa. I think it's a global debate at the moment. How much attention should universities give to STEM versus social sciences, humanities, and arts? So this is another great challenge. The other challenge related to this, in part, but not directly, is the pressure to revise the curricula in the university so that the graduates become more relevant to national development trends. At this moment, as you can well imagine, most of our development trends are through further entrenchment of financialization and a deepening of neoliberalism. So they are actually restructuring the curricula in part to have outreach components where university students are forced, if they want to continue, to go and work in private sector institutions, and to take up practically oriented graduates, to take up practically geared subjects that meet the requirement for jobs related to competences of their future employer. So this has been going on in a number of universities where the university curricula is changed to meet market demands. The depth of neoliberal takeover across higher education systems through privatization, commercialization, and deregulation can be gleaned from market-like activities referred to as academic capitalism. So these are some of the aberrations that are taking place in our own universities. The historical and contemporary review of the trajectories of higher education in Africa has vastly amplified my appreciation of Sam's visionary effort and his critical engagement in setting up this institute and the work with which it has generated empirically grounded and theoretically informed literature that challenges mainstream conceptions of agrarian transformation. He was ahead of the curve regarding production of Africa-based knowledge, training a younger generation of scholars, building South-South collaboration and solidarity. In this regard, I'll be amiss if I fail to thank all of you who have kept his dream going. Now, while these are some outlines of our past, the glorious past, the Renaissance period as we call it, and the challenges that come afterwards, in the revival, that we still have a whole lot of other subject-specific challenges that I would like to touch upon before concluding this lecture. And one of it is that even in the heydays, and some to this present day, there are subjects that a lot of African universities and African researchers have completely omitted to look into. And those specific subject matters in very many of our countries are coming to bite us. These are included, in this category I would include ethnic conflicts, conflicts in general, and gender relations. But there are very many others that researchers tend to not be interested in or not motivated sufficiently enough. And that also includes studies on agrarian change. But I won't dare talk about that in front of this audience. In terms of this neglect of identity, ethnicity, it has meant that we haven't really been able to engage by providing alternatives to these massive conflicts that our continent is going through right now. We can give temporary reflections, but we really have neglected the subject in terms of how is it that these hierarchies of ethnicity, gender, race, and other forms of hierarchies have been neglected, and what does it mean in terms of the knowledge that has been produced. Some attempt now is being made because it has become imperative. But one very persistent resistance to acknowledging that it is an important arena of research is gender. Ironically, you would think, if one were to read the World Bank literature that the World Bank is our champion of rights as far as African women are concerned. They write books, they write monographs, they write all sorts of stuff on the rights of African women and how they are really disadvantaged. And of course, we have matured enough to realize that their interest in us is just bringing women to the market and expanding the African market for their own other purposes. But nonetheless, in the absence of our male colleagues absolutely refusing to give gender relations any serious consideration in their analysis, in their research work. And I'm not talking about one sentence, oh yeah, there is also the gender issue that should be handled, which we're used to. But I mean really analytical engagement with this issue to see if it has any relevance and so forth. Our colleagues in the agrarian field as well are very much concerned about labor relations. So we in the feminist movement insist that labor is produced in the household. It just does not arrive at the market. So at the minimum, if all else is to be resisted, one's own research becomes impoverished by not looking at care work, what it means in the absence of investment by our governments in this area, which reduces labor time, and in what way does it impoverish our transformation going forward, our democratic aspirations, and so forth. So I find it very strange, and I have not been able to explain it really, this absolute and long-term resistance to take gender seriously. And we have been arguing in terms of saying it's not just because it's 50% of the population, but it does affect your own research if you do not look into these major areas that affect life. And the same goes for ethnicity and other forms of identity. If we are really talking about citizenship, democratic citizenship, in a broad and anchored way, we cannot overlook differences and different identities and what it means for our future going forward. Other issues that have come up that we talk a lot within the Codesria circles, and I imagine in the Agrarian Institute, about alternative developments. And I feel that I might be amiss because I have not followed sufficiently the literature that comes out from this institute. But what are the changes? What are other changes other than land reform and other forms of agrarian relationships that are taking place, that are affecting people's livelihoods in one sense, and also transforming agriculture? And in my own limited understanding of what is going on in this area, I think that African researchers should give more attention to public-private partnerships in agriculture. I think that neoliberalism have morphed into this dominance of financialization, especially following the 2010, the 28, the global crisis. And so the types of investment that are coming into agriculture and the ways in which they are dislocating farmers, herders, and other rural people who live on agriculture directly or indirectly is something that we really need to look at and see in what ways neoliberalism is penetrating agriculture once again. They had tried, given it up because they didn't think it was viable enough. At this point, they have come through this discourse of colossal investment opportunity that Africa, which they told us about 10 years ago was a hopeless continent, has now become this colossal investment opportunity. And although the investment into agriculture is rather limited up to this point, they are really, it has been growing, and particularly in this sub-region. And I would humbly submit that this is something that we need to look at. Finally, in terms of promotion of this public-private partnerships, one of the things that's happening, especially for those countries that depend on overseas development aid, is what they are now calling under this process of financialization, blended finance, which means that public finance donors rather give the money to multinational corporations or other private sector actors to invest in Africa, in African agriculture, fisheries, and so forth. And therefore, development finance has become drastically reduced. As you know, a lot of our governments depend on ODA for development packages. And this blended finance actually gives public money for private gain, which was supposed to bring about development and help Africa or third world countries and so forth. So these issues, I think, we need to look at much more clearly. In concluding, I want to say that our future in terms of knowledge production is recovering. I wouldn't be as optimistic as to say that it has revived, but it is in the process, let's say, for not being very negative. And there are a number of other advantages. Young people are engaged in other ways. They want to improve their own capacities and so forth. And so the university is still, regardless of other initiatives on the side, the university is still where our future lies in terms of producing knowledge that is useful, relevant, and sustainable for Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zen, for that magisterial account of knowledge production in Africa, and also for leaving us with an agenda for research. I assure you that we at the Agrarian South Network will take seriously those issues that you've laid before us. I just want to open the floor now for any questions that people might have at this stage. If you have a few questions, this would be a good time to ask them. Thank you. And Tabisile, welcome. And I can see Beatrice as well. Hey, welcome. And Hopewell, welcome. Okay.
Yeah. The president, also, this is maybe to the institute. The presenter also mentioned that there are certain topics that the universities and academia are not tackling. And since this is the Land and Agrarian Systems Institute, I was thinking that for the institute, why are you concentrating on agrarian, and yet we also have lots of conflicts in minerals, resources, displacement of peasants due to things like that. I think it just made me think that maybe in your institute, maybe there's also a need, or in academia, to look at all these, most of the conflicts right now going around the world are about mineral resources, and it seems nobody's looking at that. Thank you.
Actually, I don't have a question. I just have an expression for the presentation or for the education that has been provided this night. And me as a young man being here, it's a privilege, I would say, that to hear a naked truth or honestly truth, I would say, that Africa is a land that can give answer to all problems that are facing people in this whole world, not just to our countries, to the whole world. Yes. So I found out of the school, out of these institutions, I've done my research to know that I am the first to give birth to any race. I am the first to give education to any race. So to me, and hearing from Mama Africa talking honestly down on earth, to me it's a privilege, and it's a life itself. Land, we can't live without land. Land is everything. Everything we're utilizing is come from this land. Even this mic I'm holding now come from this land. So land is life. Without land there is no life. And if we Africans we're not prepared to take this land, we will suffer even our grandchildren will die. Okay, thank you.
I just want to say good evening to everyone, and also to thank the presenter for a very incisive lecture. I noticed that in your presentation you really centered on the problem surrounding the university, and also even in your conclusion you gave a perspective that there is some recovery in that aspect. But I think the very reality that we are here today also shows that there are other alternative ways of knowledge for production, as represented by this Sam Moyo Institute. So beyond the university, I just wanted to ask, beyond the university, what are the other alternatives? What is the future of such institutes like the Sam Moyo Institute? Is there possibility of replication of such institutes also into other areas that even my father there mentioned, the issues of ethnic conflict and all those things? Do we have room? Do we have hope? Do we have that kind of possibility where beyond the university, because as you also mentioned, you said the university depends really on public funding, but that public funding is not coming. Actually, the university is expecting that families and those who are the guardians of the learners are the ones who are going to be providing the funding. But I realize that maybe there might be another way. What are your thoughts on that possibility?
It's Mazubuko from South Africa. Following up on the last question, knowledge beyond the academy. In my work as a political organizer, I've come across forms and ways of knowledge production in popular action, popular political action. What value do you ascribe or do you put to such processes of knowledge production from popular action, from organized social forces from below?
Exposition of the problems of higher education. I just have one issue which you mentioned about the massification of the university system from a certain point onwards in the 1980s or 90s. I'm not sure exactly what the point was you were referring. Now this is, it seems, I understand your concern, yet it does reflect the youth bulge, the population demographic transition underway. I'm just curious about how to address this issue. If massification is to be curtailed, what is the alternative? Thank you.
Janice McLaughlin, and I appreciated very much your talk. And most of what you mentioned is true also here in Zimbabwe. But one of the things that I think might be unique to Zimbabwe, well, the thing that's the same is you mentioned the multiplication of institutes of higher learning in Ethiopia. The same is here. There are so many colleges, universities, higher education in Zimbabwe, but most of the graduates from these institutions, however good or bad what their learning is, does not benefit Zimbabwe because they leave. So they are benefiting the development of South Africa, of Botswana, of Australia, of UK, US, the brain drain, because we're not absorbing or creating opportunities for the graduates to use their knowledge.
I think it would do a disservice because agriculture in our continent, and I imagine in some of the other countries from the south, is such an important field that a focus on it is rare, actually. And therefore, that focus would be important to maintain. But it does not include networking with other institutions, particularly in Southern Africa. There are a lot of institutions that look into the mining sector and how it affects people on agricultural lands, how it displaces them, destroys the environment in which they work, and so forth. So that kind of collaboration can perhaps be the best way out, rather than diluting the work and the focus of this particular institution. As to the two people who spoke about first appreciating this institute, I have always been a great admirer and supporter of this initiative. And I'll be the last one to say that institutions of this nature do not produce valuable knowledge that we can all benefit from and have been benefiting from. But in having chosen a rather broad subject matter, to this day, the significant component of knowledge production in Africa takes place within universities and other institutions. It does not in any way devalue the knowledge produced in institutions like this, but the majority, the most predominant work of research and publication and distribution takes place in universities. So it wasn't really a privileging of universities, but just acknowledging the reality that exists. Social forces from below actually are the most inspiring component of any research institute, be it universities or institutions like this, because they are raising serious questions from people's lives and people's concerns. So I do believe that responding to the demands and concerns of social forces must be a priority of any institution worthy of its name in terms of producing knowledge, enriching its own knowledge through that is produced through mass participation and so forth. So that is very important. But that knowledge also benefits from linking up with more academically oriented institutions like this or universities, because whereas they might have the subject matter, which is very important and critical, they might also not have the say, for example, methodological skills to take it forward, or to have a mutual exchange of what is it that this means, the knowledge that's produced from below, and a conversation with institutions like this or university centers, I think would benefit both those engaged in mass movements and the institutions of learning themselves. And knowledge in that way would be much more enriched and more full than just something that we might like but might not reflect the realities of our own people. Indeed, one of the biggest challenges facing Africa right now is this demographic change. You know, in my own country, in the last 30 years, we have tripled the population size. So it was, in fact, in response to that they created this university overnight. But either you have people in institutions called universities who do not get to learn much, but you can have 46, 70, whatever universities, or you reorganize your resources in such a way that those institutions that you have created are well served. And so it shouldn't be just to keep the youth thinking that they are learning something, because at least speaking from the reality I know in my own country, they are really not having university education, most of them. Those who came from private schools maybe, but the rest actually do not have the financial means, do not have sufficient background to follow university education. They're first generation children going to universities, etc., etc. I'm sure you know the details. So while I'll be the last person to say that they shouldn't have university education, I think it is onerous on the state if they want to respond to this demographic bulge. They reorganize. They always find money for military investment. So you know, it's a matter of priorities as to what it is that you really want to do going forward. This business of proliferation of institutions of higher learning, so-called, some of them are really money-making shops rather than educational institutions, are a reflection of the deregulation that has come with privatization and deregulation. They don't have any standards. They can have, in my country, for example, some private universities have 2 rooms. They have 2 rooms. Now, I mean, you know, I won't even mention the word library, but classrooms become a challenge. So, but because the powers that be, particularly in institution of finance, like the World Bank, impose that private institutions should be allowed to do whatever it is they want, but they want the proliferation of private institutions of learning. It means there are no regulations. So at least if there were regulations that made sure that some standards are kept for these fee-paying students, that also can respond to some of these challenges. But this is part of our struggle, that there has to be regulation attached to education, and this privatization erodes that. As to issues of migration of the learned Zimbabweans, or we have the same problem in my country and other places, you know, there are, if I'm not mistaken, there are more Ghanaian and Ethiopian doctors in the US than in Ethiopia. I don't know about that. So this is a global phenomenon right now, that if the people are not paid well enough, they leave. So it's part, I think, of and parcel of the reforms that we have to undertake in our own country to make sure that trained human resources don't feel that they are better off going elsewhere. It might not do it, but at least that's one of the explanatory factors of why people migrate. I think that's, yeah.
We have Walter, Mamadou, and then Nancy.
Thank you, Chair, for the floor, and thank you, Zen, for this incisive lecture on the problems of higher education in Africa. Yeah. As part of this renewed agenda to revive African universities, at least here in the Southern African part of the sub-region, there's been this huge this drive which has been gathering steam, mostly from South Africa, about decolonizing the university, decolonizing both the university and the university curriculum, that we should de-link from the Eurocentric focused education and develop a truly authentic African curriculum. I also wanted to share your thoughts of what future do you think that direction will lead us in the drive to revive the African university. Thank you.
It would be also useful to add the Francophone part of this continent, because it's a different story that has been colonized universities for such a long time. But we were hoping that universities like Sheikh Anta Diop, when we had a sort of emergence of School of Thought to some time, have completely disappeared. And because of one of the issues that you raised, and that I really appreciate, and this is common to most of the universities, this is the intellectual fast food processes that came our universities with consultancy work. Most of the laboratories that have been set up also in the Francophone universities became consultancy bureaus in the university, just not giving space for long-term processes. If you add to that also that there is a lack of methodology, that is all these spaces that we had, and Kudasi has been contributing a lot in the different institutes working on methodological issues. And that was one of the concerns. I remember that I was the director of the Institute of Governance in Kodesia, and Sam has visited us, and he was talking about that. How can we rebuild this teaching of methodology in universities to revitalize what was going on? Because this is some of the constraints that many young people are facing. Put them on the field, they don't have not only the motivation to stay, but at the same time, so they are completely lost in the processes going. This is something also that we need really to address, and this is also a call for our institute just to include some spaces for methodological issues, because it's a very, very big point that we are missing sometimes in the continent. And the last one that I want to raise is the collaboration between universities also. This is a big problem. And people are more organized around, creating knowledge for the World Bank than on long-term processes. So we are stuck in a process where we don't have this collaboration, but when they exist, they are around projects. And you cannot just develop intellectual processes around this kind of thing that we have. It's just doing research for others. This is why most of the researchers in the continent have become just the language carriers for different institutions in this continent. So this is something that I probably had a long conversation with some on these issues of methodology, because for me it's a key point that we need to raise, and then it depends on the way that the collaboration between universities is taken, and this institute can contribute a lot just to raise the profile of researchers in this continent. Thank you.
Okay, Nancy.
Okay, thank you for quite an emotional trip down memory lane. I just wanted to ask about the issue of the inclusion, or spending more time on issues of gender relations. I have interacted with with some groups, and they've done social sciences, and they have a gender module in their social sciences courses. So they did what's feminism, etc. But I think there's quite a problem of it being mistaught. So even after having done these gender studies modules, feminism is still a Western thing. The people who come out having like a much broader perspective of all the global types of feminisms are people who may have had an opportunity to travel and go somewhere else, where it's not just a Western-centric sort of like form of gender studies and feminism that's being, and theory that's being taught. But it's so there's a part of the higher education curricula that is including gender studies, but it's actually being kind of mistaught for students that are there. And if there are examples of where this is changing, but in my encounters in sort of like NGOs, the learning that has happened at university, even if people have said they did a module or a course, has been quite poor.
So the last, the debate on decolonization. The debate on decolonization is really not new. It has been with us since independence. In fact, the first decade of independence, there was a whole host of debates in African universities. Mamadou just mentioned Sheikh Anta joke, but if you look at the Nigerian debates, for example, they were questioning colonial images of Africa and questions that Africans did not raise at that time. So it has been with us, and I'm sure it will continue. And it is a worthwhile, it has some strange characters in the debate, but that aside, it's very important for us to have the debate and see is our knowledge production responding to our own needs, or are we following facts? So the issue of relevance defined by us, what is relevant and not limited to market availabilities, but in much broader sense of social transformation, progressive policies and so forth. Are we really, is our research dealing with those kind of challenges and the challenges facing our people in our countries, different sectors, different classes of people? And so decolonization in that sense becomes a powerful political tool to really examine our own engagements and the type of knowledge that we produce or fail to produce. And it was interesting coming as it did together with the student movement in South Africa, because it raised much broader questions than just simple decolonization, but the distribution of resources. Who should pay university fees? And what does it mean when the majority of South African youth cannot go to school because the fees are so high? So I say, fees must fall, but the resources must come from somewhere to be distributed so that black empowerment does not become a slogan, but a real transformed South Africa or Southern Africa. So it does raise very serious questions, and I'm okay with it, but it's not new. It's just in the headlines right now, so we talk about it. But if you look at the history of debates within African institutions, this challenge of decolonizing knowledge in a way that is responsive to Africa's needs and to the views of the emergent South is a very critical and important one, because we do have hegemons who still don't want us to look at our own realities, but just sort of get books, people ship books to you and that's enough kind of thing. But the production of knowledge in terms of producing our own books, distributing our own books, and making sure that our people read and debate those things are also part of decolonization. So I have no problem with that. Mamadou, I was not actually addressing Anglophone Africa. That's why I was saying that I cannot cover the entire continent and there are exceptions. But what you suggested, Sheikh Anta, the challenges that Sheikh Anta faces right now falls exactly into the mode that I was talking about. a very distinguished university that we had hoped for and named after one of our giants, has now deteriorated into, I mean, I don't think they even go to school the whole year.
No.
So, because the university cannot accommodate the number of students that it has, and they still have expectations of a changed reality. And, you know, I mean, one of our colleagues went to his own campus, and they were going to beat him up. They didn't understand why he's back there, because he's teaching in the US and eating real hamburgers, not like the one you mentioned. And the students were not very happy with that. So I think we do have some specificities, as you mentioned. For example, a lot of collaboration is going on between universities, but because of our language disadvantage, there is a language constraint in terms of which university collaborates with whom, because not all Francophone scholars speak English and vice versa, so it becomes difficult, and so there is a tendency to reproduce the colonial division of languages and borders and all that. But I agree with you that methodology is something that we have to pay much more attention to, and institutions like this are ideal places to actually create the ability to reflect, because in a university class of 400 students, it becomes extremely challenging and difficult to teach those things. But, you know, I agree that much more attention needs to be given to methodology, because it does give a lot of capacities to think and to contest conventional wisdom. One in a day or over time, depending on the type of consultancy you have. And it has reduced really a very complex issue that requires a lot of thinking skills and exchange of ideas.
Zen, that this evening has been very worthwhile. This has been quite a lecture, in spite of the very serious issues that were discussed and the serious challenges to higher education that were exposed in this lecture. I think we are leaving here not depressed. We've discussed some agenda items. There are things that we want to pay attention to. This book was written by a group of scholars, 21 of them, from 4 continents. And it is to pay tribute and commemorate our comrade, Sam Moyo. And it's called Rethinking the Social Sciences with Sam Moyo. The book is edited by Pravinja Parisieros and Walter Chambati. And it's quite something to behold. But some of the chapters actually take forward some of his ideas and show to us new ways of thinking about issues, because Sam inspired them to do so. I'd like to call on Parisieros, one of the editors of the book, to tell us a bit about it before we launch it. Thank you very much.
I will not spend too much time. You will indulge eventually when this book actually reaches here in larger numbers. We have this copy is a preprint edition. We only have 4 to bring from the publisher, and the next print run will occur next week or the next 2 weeks. And the Institute will acquire a certain number of books which will be available here in the country by the end of next month, hopefully. Where he spent many years as a student and a teacher, where he grew intellectually. He received his intellectual formation in that context, in the presence of Shikata Diop, Samir Amin, who were the great luminaries in the 1970s at that juncture, as well as the whole group that built Codestria, including Professor Zen, but also Tandika Kantawire, Archie Wafeje, Mahmoud Mamdani, and so many others. He was an institution builder. I think that is one of his trademarks. He was also, of course, the leading figure in in stitching together this network that we have, the Agrarian South Network, together with Issa Shivji, who was his close ally from the beginning, who shared with him all these ideals about maintaining one's faith in political economy, in liberation, in Pan-Africanism, and South-South solidarity. Also, George Chikata, our other colleague on the board, Kodja Amanor, and several others from South Africa, Lungi Sile, Fred Hendricks, were very important in building this network from the beginning. The network gained a consistency and a certain solidity through the summer school, which is what we are, which brought us together this week. This is the 12th edition of the summer school. We have also published books, tricontinental books. This has been our vocation. All our books have been tricontinental. And we also launched a journal in 2012, the Agrarian South Journal, which is a journal of political economy, which again has a South-South format. So all this, taking stock of Sam's vision and his mission, brings us to the conclusion that he had a very specific role in what we have called epistemic sovereignty, or the struggle for epistemic sovereignty, which is precisely what has been talked about this evening. The scientific infrastructure, Sam felt that very directly, that the absence of funding, public funding, for research. Sam also had to negotiate his way through a diversity of donors. The problem of publishing monopolies, which are controlled by the North. Adequate funding for universities, publicly funded universities, all that is an essential element of epistemic sovereignty. The control over the knowledge that we produce. Our knowledge is often used, abused, taken to places that are unimaginable in terms of being distorted. So we need to have mechanisms to control the trajectory of the ideas that we produce. That involves having our own publications, and involves acknowledging our predecessors properly. And it means the exercise of epistemic sovereignty also means having what Mazibuku was referring to earlier, an organicity in our intellectual work, some real connection with the struggles that are on the ground. There's a final aspect to this notion of epistemic sovereignty that Sam incorporated, which is that South-South collaboration is the only possible avenue to obtaining universality in the social sciences. South-South collaboration, if obtaining universality is necessary, which of course we believe it is, it requires ascertaining particularities, and this can only be done in a comparative and a collaborative effort among South and North and South partnerships. So this is the final aspect which I believe needs to be stressed. The book, I think Praveen will speak a bit more about the chapters, or no? No?
Not speaking.
Okay, please, let me just, I would just like to speak on the structure. There's three parts of the book. One is on the epistemic vision and contributions of Brother Sam. Jody Chikata has the first article, but also Bill Martin is right, where is Bill is right there. Also, very many others. Gladys Lecchini from Argentina. Lino Sommer is also here, somewhere. Yes. Huh? Oh, you will call them. Okay. Okay. So I will not go through this anymore. But anyway, we have from several continents. The second section is on land, labor, and agrarian questions, and the third section is entitled Unfinished Dialogues on Revolution and Liberation. So you will feel free later to have a look and also eventually acquire the book. It is also becoming, I believe, to make a reference to a eulogy that Friedrich Engels made to Karl Marx at his graveside. Some almost 150 years ago. And Engels said, "I make bold to say that, though he may have had many opponents, he had hardly one personal enemy." And I believe that applies to Brother Sam. May he rest in peace.
Thank you. May I ask all the authors who are present to come here so that we launch the book? Okay. So, without further ado, I declare Rethinking the Social Sciences with Sam Moyo, edited by Pravinja Parisieros and Walter Chabati, really long. Thank you.
Okay, Walter, you give me your copy. These are advanced copies, and we would like to present these to some very important people who are here, beginning with Mama Moyo.
Mama Moyo.
Beatrice.
Beatrice.
Welcome there. Sister Beatrice. And to Professor Tadesse.
Comrades and colleagues who toiled to make this book a reality, in honor of a comrade to my co-editors, and to me, a brother and mentor who took me under his shoulder and taught me the ropes of research. Colleagues, thank you very much. Comrades, thank you very much for all your efforts to make this book a reality. But also want to thank you all for coming through tonight to attend both the Inaugural Lecture and the book launch. We hope that the book will be widely read and widely debated across all parts of the globe, not necessarily in Africa, but across all parts of the globe. As the Professor said, that the book will be available, we hope, by the end of February. Please feel free to come through to our office to access your copy of this wonderful book with contributions from colleagues across the 4 continents. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
So thank you, once more, thank you for coming, and I want to declare this event closed. Thank you.